Okay, so it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's class, which is another perennials class. But this time I thought that we would try something a little bit different instead of just talking about perennials and, in a big list. I thought we would maybe try and do it talking about different perennials that fit into different types of designs. So I'm going to start by talking about, well, I guess maybe I should introduce Weber Basin. That would probably be a good idea. So I'm with Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. My name is Janice Terry, and I run the Learning Garden here. We also have David Rice on. He'll be helping answering questions. So if you have any questions during this presentation, please use the Q&A button instead of the raised hand option. It's really difficult with these online classes to facilitate raised hands, and so if you could just type in your question in the Q&A portion, then Dave will try and answer those as we go through the class, just to help us keep this class to a reasonable length. But if we either don't get to your question, if he doesn't get to your question during the class, then we'll make sure to address it at the end of class. That way, those of you who don't have questions or you're feeling pretty confident about growing perennials, then you can just pop off and start growing some perennials. So we're going to start this class by talking a little bit about some basics about what perennials are, how to maintain them, how to grow them, how to select the proper perennial for your yard, and then we're going to go through a couple of different designs. So we're just going to start talking about it. So perennials are a lot of fun. I think that they're basically the best. I prefer them over almost any other plant material, maybe besides trees, because who doesn't love a good tree, right? But so what are perennials? A lot of people get confused. They get mixed up between perennials and annuals. So perennials are the plants that come back year after year after year. They will come back for at least 3 years, but probably more. So we're going to talk about a few perennials that are considered short-lived perennials, and they typically live between 3 and 5 years. And we're going to talk about some long-lived perennials that can sometimes live for 20 plus years. So we'll talk about those. Perennials differ from trees and shrubs. You know, most trees and shrubs also, they're technically perennials in that they live from year to year to year, but trees and shrubs don't die back all the way to the ground. And perennials, there are some exceptions, but most perennials die back to the ground in the fall. And then they overwinter, and then in the spring, they put up a whole new flush of new growth. And then typically, this is why we, give classes and have our large learning garden, is to teach people that you can have a really attractive, gorgeous yard and use less water than the typical Utah yard that we see that's almost 100% lawn. So perennials typically use a lot less water than annuals or lawn. You know, in our learning garden, we have thousands and thousands of perennials, and we water them usually, like once a week, twice a week during the hot parts of the year. So they need a lot less water than lawn or annuals. Not that we would ever villainize lawn or annuals, but just keep annuals in pots and put them places where they're going to be seen all the time, maybe by your seating areas, around your door or something like that. And then limit the amount of lawn that you have to areas where you're actually going to use it. We never encourage lawn to be used as a default ground cover. It should be a designed element in the yard. Put it where it's going to be used and have an appropriate amount of lawn. So more information on that can be found in our local scapes classes, where we teach people how to design a good yard for Utah. So you can find our class schedule on our website, and as well as past local scapes classes that we've taught online, you can get on and watch those. So we're going to talk a little bit about picking the perfect perennial. Too often people find a plant that they like, and then they just try and fit it somewhere in their yard. But really, we should reverse that. We should look at the different characteristics of our yard and then find the appropriate plants that are going to fit well into those spaces. So for example, if you have a really shady yard but you're like, well, Janice, she told me that the agastache plant or hummingbird mint is one of her favorite plants, and so I really want to put it in my yard, but the agastache needs full sun, but I'm going to just try and fit it in my full shade yard, and hopefully it'll work out. You're going to wonder why that plant is not doing well. And it's not going to do well because it's not the proper plant for the proper place. So that's just a principle that we really like to stress. When it comes to picking plants, sometimes people get kind of overwhelmed because you go to the nursery and there's a billion options. And so here are some ways to just kind of pare it all down to a manageable amount of plants to pick from. And the first thing to really think about is your style. Just kind of go with what you like. If you're going for more of like an English garden look, or if you like the low water look, maybe you're going for deer resistant plants, or you're really focused on pollinators, focusing on those type of plants can help narrow the field down. Whenever you're at the nursery or garden center, make sure that you're checking the individual plants for insects or diseases. It's so funny to me how sometimes we'll plant hundreds of plants, and we'll have 3 of the same plant all next to each other in a row, and we'll have one that'll randomly die, and we're like, what happened? How did that one plant die when it's getting the exact same amount of water, the exact same amount of sun exposure, the exact same amount, or the exact same soil? Like how does this happen? And sometimes it's because we bring in diseases on plants, and all plants, when you plant them, well, not all, but most of them go through what we call transplant shock. So if they're not already healthy in their containers and you put them in the ground, sometimes that shock can be enough to push them over the edge and kill them. So when you're checking your individual plants at the nursery, make sure that you're looking, and if there's any weird coloration or anything that might look like a gray fuzz on any of the leaves or anything, leave that plant, pick a different one, and take the best looking plant home. And then just check under some of the leaves and make sure that there aren't any insects, or that there's not a lot of insect damage. I love gardenias. They're one of my favorite plants. They don't grow outside in Utah. You can put them on your patio in the summertime, but you have to bring them inside for the winter. And they just have a white bloom that's so pretty, and it smells so good. And so I have tried to grow them several times at my house, and 3 times I purchased them, and 3 times I brought home spider mites. And had I properly inspected the plants, I probably would have known not to take that specific plant home. So just be really wary of the plants that you're purchasing. And also, while we're talking about picking plants from the nursery, too often people get more concerned with buying the biggest plant rather than the healthiest. So if you're at the nursery and you're looking for a black-eyed Susan, let's say, and there are several in different pots, and there's one that's really big and tall but kind of lanky, and one that's short and stocky and really dark green, always go with the shorter, stockier plant. That means that it's been getting the appropriate amount of light, and it's not being overwatered. So those are just some things to think about. Really pay attention to what your USDA hardiness zone is. So that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture has taken it upon themselves, which is awesome, to separate the country out into what they call hardiness zones. And you can find your specific hardiness zone by your zip code on the USDA's website. So just go in and Google USDA hardiness zone, and it'll ask, there's a box right on the front of the first thing that's going to come up that's going to ask for your zip code. Type in your zip code, and it'll give you the appropriate hardiness zone. And then when you're looking at plant tags, and I'm going to move my video really fast, I've got this example of fall spirea, which is a stilbea plant, which is one of my favorite shade plants, and a lot of people have a hard time finding a lot of shade plants that bloom. This is a really good one for our area. The one thing with this plant though is that it does need to be kept a little bit more moist than a lot of the other plants that do well in our area. So if you have a spot that just is kind of always wet, for some reason. Maybe it's a flower bed that's also getting hit with some of your sprinklers and it's in shade, and so the soil is always a little bit moist. This astilbe, these false spireas can be a really good option. So if you look at the tag, it has almost all the information that you're going to need to make sure you're buying the right plant. So it'll have the sun exposure. So like I was talking about, if you have a really shady yard, don't try and grow plants that need full sun. You're just not going to be successful, and you're going to waste a lot of time and money. And it'll also talk about how much water these plants need. So we always like to encourage something that we call hydrozoning, which is grouping plants with like needs together. So if you have a plant like this astilbe that needs more water, don't put it on the same zone as your cactuses that don't want any extra water, you know, because in order to give one plant the appropriate amount of water, you're going to end up either underwatering or overwatering the other plants on that same zone. So make sure that everything in one zone has relatively the same water needs. It says it needs well-draining soil. So if you live in a home that is just clay, you're like, Janice, I could literally open a pottery business and just use my soil. This plant might not be the best for you, but there are some good plants that do okay in really heavy clay soils. Then it usually has the size. So astilbes get anywhere between 20 and 30 inches. So think about that when you're planting. I like to plant big in the back, and then as you go forward in the planting bed, your plant should be getting smaller. That way you're not blocking anything. And then the very bottom there, we have the USDA hardiness zone. There is a second hardiness zone that it's a magazine out of California came up with their own hardiness zone. Unless it specifies that it's the Sunrise hardiness zone, you just assume that it's the USDA hardiness zone. And it's as long as you're matching or making sure that your perennial falls with the range of hardiness zone, or that your hardiness zone falls within that range. You know how this astilbe says hardiness zone 3 through 8. Let's say you live in Layton, so you're roughly a zone 6. 6 falls within 3 to 8, and so you can have confidence that this plant is not going to die due to the cold weather. The hardiness zones are based off of the low temperatures. So just to kind of give you an idea, Ogden and Layton, we're a zone 6. If you go up to Park City or Morgan, you're a zone 5. And in our higher elevations, like up in our mountains, it's about a zone 4. So that's kind of what you should be looking at. And then another thought on I guess we could, this tag doesn't have the bloom time, but most tags will say like what season this plant is going to bloom in. So let's see, wonderful performance, long-lasting clear white plumes borne atop deep cut bronze green foliage. So this just says it has a long bloom time, which astilbes do. They bloom for a really long time. But when you're at the nursery and maybe you're picking out a bunch of perennials for a perennial bed, make sure that you're not going to accidentally bring home 100 plants that all bloom in the spring, and then come summer and fall, you don't have anything but green foliage. So I just would recommend that you aim to have a third of your plants bloom in the spring, a third bloom through the summer, and then a third bloom either late summer or fall, just to make sure that you're having a lot of color in your beds. We're going to talk a little bit about maintenance now. So compared to annuals and grass, perennials are pretty darn low maintenance, but as with anything, it doesn't matter what you plant, you're going to have some kind of maintenance. You know, you could pour your whole yard in concrete and there would still be maintenance to do. So just be wary of that, right? A lot of people come to us and they say, I want a lot of plants, I want it to be beautiful, I want it to be colorful, but I don't want a lot of maintenance. And if you want a really fantastic yard, you're going to have to put in some time and effort. So, but not nearly as much as you're going to be putting in for annuals or grass, like I was just saying. So just a few maintenance tidbits. with perennials, your spring maintenance is just going to include mostly cleanup from the fall, from the previous fall and the winter time. But a lot of our perennials really do like to have a little bit of fertilizer, especially in the spring. We're going to talk about some perennials that are Utah natives or really low water, and a lot of those plants do not need hardly any fertilizer, and they're going to be much lower maintenance, maybe not quite as lush looking, but a lot of perennials do really appreciate a little bit of fertilizer in the spring. Spring cleanup can kind of be overwhelming between just cleaning up the plant material that's died back to the ground and then weeding. But you know, it's kind of fun to be out in the springtime after a long cold winter, and as the weather starts to kind of warm up and get good, it feels good to be outside. But just clean up whatever you didn't get in the fall. And then staying on top of the weeds is so important. You know, we have a lot of people bring us concerns about why they don't want to make a shift from, or why they're wary about making a shift from a predominantly lawn landscape to a perennial tree, shrub, ornamental grass, heavy landscape. And a lot of it has to do with concerns about how much time they're going to spend maintaining their yard. Because when people just think it's going to be so much weeding. And probably the first 2 years after you put in a new planting bed, you are going to have to do quite a bit of weeding. But the weeds do really taper off after that, particularly if you are putting down the appropriate amount of mulch. So mulch is just a layer of some kind of material that you put on top of the ground around your plants, and it does a couple of things. It keeps the moisture in, which is going to help you not have to water as often, and then it's going to keep some weeds from growing. You know, weeds are weeds for a reason. A lot of them can grow with hardly any sunlight, hardly any water, and they just seem to go crazy. So just be wary of that. But having that layer of mulch will really cut down on the amount of weeds that get that opportunity to germinate. We also recommend that perennial beds are irrigated through a drip system. And I wish I would have put a slide on here of what a drip system looks like. But we have several other presentations where we talk about irrigation. But basically, the goal of a drip system is you are delivering the water directly to the base of the plant. So you're not really watering the areas in between the plants, which is going to cut back on the weeds that'll germinate. And then it's going to save a lot of water as well. So if you're mulching and using drip, you're going to really cut back on the time that you're going to need to spend maintaining those weeds. And then I have a little note here about maybe applying a pre-emergent. So if you're not opposed to chemicals in the garden, particularly in areas of the garden where you're not growing plants that you're going to eat, like a lot of people are really wary about chemicals in their vegetable garden. But for a flower bed, you're not going to be consuming those plants probably. And so, a lot of people are more willing to use chemicals. And pre-emergents can really cut back on the amount of time you're going to spend pulling weeds. And basically what it is you put it out in the early spring before the weeds have really started growing, and you work it in and water it in, and it creates a thin layer of really weak chemical that's not going to be able to stop your perennials from popping through, but it's gonna stop the weed seeds from germinating. So it does a fantastic job, but you do need to reapply typically halfway through the summer. So some things to be aware of. Weed barrier fabric, since we're talking about weeds anyways, we don't really recommend them that much anymore, just because it changes the biology of the soil. Our soils are full of all kinds of little microbes and worms that need to have organic matter, or stuff that was once living, like tree bark or dead leaves, stuff like that. These microbes in the soil digest those, and as they're digesting, they improve the structure of the soil. So if none of that organic matter is making it into the soil, there's no food for those microbes, and the weed barrier fabric keeps those from making their way in, and you basically sterilize the soil. And then they, you know, leaves blow in, dust blows in, and over time you have a favorable condition for weeds to grow on top of the fabric. So some people love fabric, some people don't like it. We are on the side of we don't really like it. We don't use it in our own learning garden, and we are pretty good at staying on top of the weeds. So, and spring is the second best time to plant. We're going to talk about how and why fall is the best time to plant, but planting plants in the spring is a great option. You're just going to want to make sure that they're kept nice and moist, especially as the weather warms up. And when you buy plants in the spring, you typically have a better selection than when you buy plants in the fall time. Another maintenance issue to really think about is just to make sure that your irrigation is functioning properly. A lot of times people don't check their irrigation systems, and then they're wondering why plants are dying or why their grass has a brown spot, and it's because they haven't taken the time in the spring to turn on every zone and just make sure there's no breaks or clogged heads or anything like that. Let's see. Then summer maintenance, pretty easy stuff. You're gonna deadhead to encourage more blooms. A lot of perennials you don't even really have to deadhead. There's a lot of really low maintenance ones that could take it or leave it, right? Like they don't really care if you're gonna deadhead them or not. Staying on top of the weeds is really important. We already talked about maybe reapplying a pre-emergent. And it's the third best time to plant, simply because the weather is so hot that it can be kind of hard to keep those plants as moist as they need to be while their little root balls are starting to expand and get established in the soil. So fall maintenance, you can start cleaning up plants as they die back to the ground. And there's a couple of exceptions that we're going to talk about as we go through and talk about some different perennials. But typically as plants die back, you can just clean them up as you go. You know, sometimes by the time you hit fall, you're tired of yard work and you're just kind of like, oh, I'm just going to let it wait to the spring. And that is okay. Like there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes there are some pests that like to harbor in dead plant material. So like it's a good idea to do things like till your vegetable garden in and just not let those plants sit on the ground, like squash bugs. That's where they like to harbor and stuff like that. So by tilling it in or removing the dead material, you will minimize some bug issues. Like box elder bugs, they live through the winter in dead plant material. So things to think about. Staying on top of the weeds is just as important in the fall as it is the rest of the year. And fall is the best time to plant because if a plant is hardy to your hardiness zone, planting it in the fall right before it goes into winter shouldn't kill it. As long as it has enough moisture, it shouldn't die. And then it's going to have all of the fall and all of the winter where even though it's not actively putting on new green growth, those roots are getting established. There's a lot of growth still going on underneath the ground. And then it has all of those cool spring months to get growing and, you know, more established before it hits the heat of the summer. And I think more people, we lose more plants because of planting in the summer than any other time of year. So just be wary of those things. So we're going to talk about just a few different lists of plants that I put together. We're going to talk about your traditional English garden. You know, a lot of our design principles that we use still in Utah were developed back in England or back in France, and it came west with the pioneers. And so as much as we don't like really encourage lots of lawn like they have in England or like they have in some of these other places where they don't have to worry about irrigation because they're getting so much rain. There are a lot of awesome plants that do really good in Utah that can still give you that feel of having like an English style garden that's very high density planting, lots of color, lots of blooms. Sometimes English style gardens do need more moderate watering, but we'll talk about those as we go. Then we're going to talk about low water gardens that look very lush. Some plants that will do well in that situation. And there's going to be a lot of like bleed over between these different lists. And we'll talk about that as we go along. Then we're going to talk about some good shade options for Utah. And that, you know, we get a lot of people asking questions about what plants do well in the shade, and we're going to show you some. And then we're going to talk about some pollinators, and I've lumped the pollinator and Utah natives together, and we're going to talk about why when we get there. And then I've got a short, not super comprehensive list of deer resistant plants. And these were formulated based on questions that we commonly get. We always have people asking about shade. We always have people asking about pollinators. We have a lot of people want to, you know, they're moving over to wanting to be more sustainable. So focusing on Utah natives is a good idea. And then a lot of our neighbors who live in higher elevations often have issues eating their plants, especially in the wintertime. So basically what I've done is I tried to find good examples of different styles of gardens, and then we're going to talk about the plants in each of these pictures. So May-night salvia is a fantastic little perennial. This is a very common one. You'll see it in a lot of park strips around businesses. We have a lot of it in our learning garden, and it's just great. It puts on a big flush of those dark purple stalks in the late spring. But if you keep them deadheaded, they will rebloom in the fall, but they'll also kind of just send up a couple of spikes here or there through the winter time. They're an extremely low water plant, so this is one that while it's going to work in an English style setting, it's also going to do really well in a lush, low water garden as well. It smells really good. Salvias are sages, you know, they're synonymous. Salvias equal sages. So they smell really good. And if you've noticed these plants around, you've probably noticed that they are usually covered in bees. So if you're looking for plants to put in a pollinator garden, this is a really good option. Chives. It's really common in English style gardens to add herbs to your perennial beds. There are a lot of herbs that do really, really well all through the summertime. So these particular chives are a good example. They start blooming really early in the springtime. Like we're talking early March, they start blooming, and then they'll just continue blooming almost all through the summer. They'll bloom more prolifically if you do deadhead them, but you really don't have to. You can see that there's some bright purple blooms in this picture, as well as some lighter pink blooms, and those lighter pink blooms are the blooms that they're already spent, and that they just sit like that on the plant, which isn't really unattractive. You know, I think it looks kind of cute. So deadhead it if you want more fresh blooms. Don't worry about it if you don't mind the look of the spent blooms. But if you do deadhead it, you will get more new growth, which is better for culinary purposes if you're gonna put it in a stew or whatever. I use chives quite a bit and stuff. It's a really mild, oniony flavor. Very good, very good. But the foliage looks really nice as well. Common in English gardens, but do very well in other places as well. So peonies are kind of interesting because a lot of people lump peonies into the bush category, right? Where really they're just a bush-like perennial, like a shrub-like perennial, because they die back to the ground every single year. But they put on this impressive display of blooms in the summertime. And a lot of the blooms are so big that they really benefit from having some kind of support. Like you'll see where people will get a round support that has wires going both ways, and you put it over your peony plant, just maybe 18 inches up, and then the stalks grow through the support, and then as they start to lean over, the support helps them stay up instead of falling all the way to the ground. But these are really, really good. They do good in our area, super pretty. When it comes to English gardens, like I said, you're focusing on bright colored plants, bright green foliage. You're not so concerned about different colors of foliage. You're mostly going for that green and going for pretty fantastic blooms. So we have, this picture is a wee bit fuzzy, so I apologize, but it's a nice little English garden border. And a lot of these plants, do great in our low water settings as well. So here we have a coreopsis plant. They bloom midsummer to frost usually, so a really nice long bloom period. No need to deadhead. This one would honestly be like a big pain in the rear end to try and deadhead, just because there's so many blooms and the blooms are so small that it would be really hard, but you really don't need to. Deadheading this plant is not going to encourage a larger flush of flowers like deadheading other types of flowers would do. And this one's fairly drought tolerant. It's not as drought tolerant as some options, but it's pretty good at, you know, growing and being beautiful in areas that don't receive very much water. And coreopsis is a huge family of plants. So we have bright oranges and bright reds and yellows, and we have plants that grow 3 feet tall, and we have other ones that stay 6 inches tall. And so, you know, whatever you're looking for your own flower bed, there's probably an awesome coreopsis that's going to fit. Then we have these black-eyed Susans, also a cute little yellow plant. These guys, once again, can grow pretty tall, depending on the variety that you get. And they're going to bloom from summertime all the way to frost as well. So lots of color in the fall. They're fairly drought tolerant. In fact, I'd say that they're pretty darn drought tolerant. We have a few of these in our garden. And by a few, I mean we have a lot. We have a lot of these in our garden. And when we planted the original plants, they all had emitters to them. But then over time, they've just spread through the flower bed and even to areas where they're not getting any irrigation. And, you know, as you look over the bed, they're bigger where they're getting supplemental water and just smaller where they're not. So they're kind of a fun little plant, especially if you have an area that you don't really care if it takes over. They can get a little bit weedy though, but typically not to the point of like what you think of as a weed in the garden. So then we have these cone flowers, and cone flowers are one of my favorite plants of all time. I'm gonna move there we go, so you guys can see that better. So the most common cone flower is the purple variety, but there's a huge selection of cone flowers. And just like the black-eyed Susans and just like the coreopsis, some get and others are going to get 18 inches tall. So lots of cool options to think about. And they're hardy to zone 3. So if you do live in an area where you're like, yeah, Janice, I know you're saying that my zone is a zone 5, but I just am having a really hard time getting anything to survive the winter time, this is a really good option. And they're very, very, very drought tolerant. And they're kind of cool too, because while deadheading will improve the amount of blooms you're going to get, like you're going to get more fresh new blooms if you do deadhead. The spent heads, like after the petals are dropped off and you just have that little cone shape that's in the middle of the flower left, it kind of goes black and it doesn't really look bad. If anything, it looks kind of cool. And a lot of people will leave those through the winter time, just as kind of like a fun little winter interest point, but the birds love them. Like some of the finches that hang around all through the winter time will eat the coneflower seeds as nourishment. And I did add an extra, just moving my little video all around, I did add kind of a cool coneflower that is new as of the last 5 years. There's this Supreme series that they've done, and how cool is this plant? Like instead of just the typical cone, they've bred it so that that cone also has really cool petals coming out of it, and it looks almost like a fuzzy teddy bear. And so this flamingo is this cool light pink color, but they have Supreme cantaloupe that's like looks like a cantaloupe color. It's the exact same color as when you cut through a cantaloupe. And they have the Supreme, I think it's called honeydew, a light green one even. So kind of just some cool plants, and they do so good in our area that I would highly recommend them. Oh, and so far I will make a note about the ones that can handle shade as we go along. But so far, all the ones we've talked about need to have sun. So here we have these awesome speedwells. These are so common in English gardens, like when you're in England and you're looking at people's gardens or you're wandering around some of the public gardens. Veronicas are everywhere. And they vary in size and color. Super long-lived perennials. They're a pretty good pollinator flower. They can tolerate partial shade, but you're going to get much more blooms, or many more blooms, if you keep it in sunny areas of the yard, or try and let them have as much sun as possible. But they do okay in some shady areas. This is the same family as the ground cover Veronica that some of you guys are probably familiar with. Same family, very different looking plant. And this one is one that you'll want a deadhead to keep it blooming. So here we have a cute little English pathway, and we've got a couple of fun flowers. I'm just going to move my video back, and we'll just leave it in the corner here. But lavender is such a traditional English garden plant. Very low water though, like it does so good in our area, in our really dry, really poor soils. It's actually native to the Mediterranean. And if you think about it, the Mediterranean area is very similar to our own area. It's relatively dry. We get hot summers. And we get cold winters. Their winters aren't that cold, but it just kind of makes sense that it does so good here. And here we have two examples. We have the traditional purple, and then there's also a white flowering lavender, which is kind of interesting. And the white flowering ones tend to be a little bit more mild in their scent and in their flavor than the blue or purple ones. But they're really impressive. I just realized that I didn't change the information. So they are a shrub-like perennial, in that they don't die back to the ground every year. In fact, in the late spring every year, you want to just cut back 1/3 of the plant. But yeah, we'll just go to the next slide. Foxglove is a really common flower used in English gardens as well. Does great in our area. It is a short-lived perennial, but it reseeds pretty well. It's almost like a hollyhock type plant where, you plant your hollyhocks and then it never seems like the same hollyhock is blooming. A lot of them die after only 3 years, but they put on so many seeds that you typically have enough reseeding happen that you can have them for several years without needing to repurchase them from the nursery. It does need to be in the shade in our area. They do not handle full sun, and they do prefer to be a little bit more moist than some of the other perennials like lavender that can handle having next to no moisture. And really any flower that has this kind of tube-like shape like the foxglove does is going to attract hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are going to absolutely love this plant. So it's pretty pollinator friendly. But the rest of the plant is really poisonous. So I once went to England with my sisters for a few weeks, and because I'm a horticulturalist, I drug them to so many gardens. And at Alnwick Castle, where they filmed a lot of Harry Potter, they had this garden that was just full of poisonous plants. But every plant there had some kind of story to it, right? And they had foxglove here because it's used in so many mystery novels as the murder weapon. Like Agatha Christie uses it in 4 of her novels as the way that the victim was killed. So be careful with it. It's pretty bad, but it's also used to treat heart. I can't remember what it's called, but it's when your heartbeat is irregular. Some of the medicine that they use to treat that is derived from this foxglove plant. So for those of you that have been to some of my classes, you know that I love a plant with a story, and this plant just has a lot of story to it. So kind of interesting. So here we have daylilies. Daylilies are super common, but they're so cool, right? Like we do have some daylilies in our area that is like, oh, another daylily, ooh, but there are so many cool blooms, and they range from orange to red to purple to black to, pinks, to a mix of all the colors on one plant, it seems. Some of them are longer bloomers than others, some stay shorter than others. It's such a wide, class of plants that there's something for everybody in this one. It's typically a spring bloomer, but a lot of them do bloom through the summertime, and a lot of them will keep blooming through the late summer into the fall, depending on the variety. One thing that I really like about the daylily is that after it's done blooming and you've deadheaded off all of the spent blooms, it just looks like a nice ornamental grass. And so it'll add some interest to your garden without kind of being fuddy-duddy. And these ones can handle some part shade and still have a pretty impressive bloom. Now we're going to talk about some low water plants. And, we've talked about a couple of low water options already, like the lavender and the May-night sage or May-night salvias. So they could also come into this category, but we're going to talk about some plants that do really well with hardly any water. And this first one is Walker's Low Catmint. This is not as potent as the straight catmint variety, so you don't really need to worry about like all the neighborhood cats congregating at your Walker's Low Catmint. They're not nearly as attracted to it, but it is really fragrant. It smells very good, and it blooms basically all season. So they've started blooming right now, and they will bloom until it freezes, which is pretty impressive. And the bees absolutely love this plant. Absolutely love it. This is one of those plants that if it's in a park strip and you walk past it, you can hear like the zzz, you can almost hear the plant buzzing with how many bees there are on it. And this is a zone 3 as well. So if you're having a hard time finding plants that are surviving the winter, this would be a good option as well. Yarrow is a great plant, and it has a bad rap, and that makes me sad because it blooms summer almost through the fall. And this is one that a lot of people like to deadhead it just to keep it looking nice and neat. But the spent heads kind of just sit there and look interesting. They don't really feed birds like the coneflower does, but they're still just kind of an interesting seed head that you can leave through the winter if you want. But they will lay down with the heavy snow. But these guys will tolerate a wide range of soil conditions as well as moisture levels. So they're pretty darn hardy. A lot of people, the reason they have a bad rap is because the wild variety will take over the world. So, but you can't even buy that in the nursery. Like, it's considered a weed in a lot of areas, and so they don't even sell it. But there are some incredible cultivars, and I've got this great picture here of one called Paprika. And I like this plant because the young blooms are this brilliant red color, and then as the blooms get older, they fade to kind of like that dark pink color and then kind of a dusty light pink color. So you have several different shades on one plant, which can add a lot of interest. So that's Paprika. And it's a common one. Like, you can find this cultivar almost anywhere when the varieties are good. Penstemons are really cool to add to your yard, especially in Utah, because Utah has more wild native penstemons than any other state, which is kind of cool. These pine leaf penstemons come in yellows or reds, and they have an evergreen needle-like foliage that stays green all through the winter. So that's kind of fun, like a way to add a little bit of winter interest, especially because winters in Utah can be kind of bland, So adding stuff that you know is going to look good through the entire winter is a great idea. These guys will not need any water once they're established. So if you have like a park strip that you're like, I don't have any irrigation to this park strip, what do I do? What do I plant here? Plant some of these pine leaf penstemons. They'll do great. And they're so good for pollinators. And because they're a Utah native, they're good for our native bees. And they're just a really good little plant. We do have a ton of penstemons, and I think I have a couple others in here. So here we have some sedums. Sedums are a low growing ground cover, come in so many different cultivars. Most of them are grown for their little fleshy leaves. They're not necessarily grown for their flower, but some do put on some pretty cool flowers. These guys can tolerate very low moisture conditions, and they can handle a little bit of light shade, but if you put them in an area with too much shade, they won't live as many years. Like, they're going to be more of a short-lived perennial. And they do kind of get leggy if they're in too much shade. That being said, though, there's a particular cultivar called Dragon's Blood that's pretty red, like it's almost like a blood color. Like, it's pretty cool. But we've had it in some shady areas, and it's been there for years, and it just stays nice and compact. So some things to think about. I would maybe try it. This ice plant, however, does not do good in any shade, but it's kind of fun. Ice plant comes in so many fun colors as well. And it's kind of nice because it puts on a really impressive flush of flowers in the springtime, but then it typically just has like a few flowers for the rest of the year. So even though it might not be as impressive as it is in the spring, it still is adding color and interest and texture into your yard. And the hardy yellow variety in particular looks really cool in the winter time because it's an evergreen as well. It doesn't die back all the way, or yeah, die back to the ground every year. But those fleshy little leaves turn bright red. So that's kind of cool, right? You know, another way to add some winter interest. Hyssop is, oh, I feel like I forgot a slide. No, I moved the slide. Okay, but hyssop is the plant I was talking about earlier. It's also called hummingbird mint, and it's one of JT, which is Janice Terry, which is me, one of my favorite plants. This one in my top 5 favorite plants of all time. Some varieties stay pretty short. Some of them though get really tall and they're so impressive. So if you are looking for some plants with, you know, where you're going to get some bang for your buck, they're going to grow up and fill in an area and be really impressive and bloom for a long time, this plant is one to go with. The hummingbirds absolutely love it, and so do the moths, because they have those tube-shaped flowers like I was talking about before. And this plant smells so good. It almost smells like anise, or like kind of like a licoricey, a black licoricey smell, but mild and sweet, and it's so nice. So if you guys are taking notes, I'm going to pause for 1 second and let you write down hyssop. It does come in some more purple varieties and more yellow varieties, but this one, this Coronado hyssop, is my favorite, and that's what's pictured right here, where it's almost like a purpley orange, and it's just so pretty. So this is another one of my favorites for getting a cool plant, lots of bang for your buck. Russian sage. Some people don't love the smell of this particular sage. It is quite strong, and this one does not tolerate extra moisture. So if you put it somewhere where it's not going to be allowed to completely dry out, you're probably going to lose after just a couple years. But this is another one that the bees just go absolutely crazy for. And this is one plant, one perennial that you will want to wait until spring to prune it. And that's just because it does tend to get a little bit of winter dieback. And so what you do is you wait until it's starting to leaf out again, and you prune back whatever hasn't started to leaf out. But this one's kind of fun. And so I went to school and did plant science, and we had to memorize a ton of Latin names. And, you know, I can remember most Latin names, but this one was my favorite one. So I'm just going to impress everybody with my Latin for 1 minute. The scientific name for Russian sage is Perovskia atriplycifolia. So when you're done watching this, rewind it to this little minute and practice that so you can impress your neighbors. So we're going to move on to some shade plants. So we have the hosta, which is like the poster child of shade plants. Everybody knows the hosta. Some people think they're boring. I think they're so cool. And that's because there are hundreds of different varieties. And most of them are not grown for their flower, but there are a handful that have been bred because they do put on some nice, sweet smelling lavender or white flowers. So if you want more flowers, you can find some hostas that put on some pretty cute little flowers, but they're not like spectacular. It's not like, whoa, look at that hyssop plant, you know. But they do come in a lot of different varieties. And one thing I will mention with shade is that there just aren't a ton of plants that bloom that are full shade. So what you're going to focus on to get a lot of interest into those shady flower beds, focus on plants with cool, different colored foliage. And it'll still look really gorgeous and really beautiful and very interesting without having to have all those flowers, which you're just not going to find. So, but hostas are really cool. The one issue that people seem to commonly and routinely have issues with their hostas are slugs. computer is being a little weird all of a sudden. I think we're there. Are we there? Does this look normal? Okay. We're good. Oh, Brody's giving me the thumbs up. I apologize. I got a brand new battery in my laptop yesterday, and for some reason it is not liking the fact that it died or got low battery. So sorry for the delay. Hopefully hopefully we're good. Hopefully you're all still with me. But coral bells are another really cool plant that you can use in the shade. And once again, coral bells, there's like two varieties that have really impressive blooms. There's kind of a purpley one that gets kind of some cool white blooms, and then there's just a regular green foliage that gets really cool red blooms. So, but you can see from these two examples that there's the coolest range of colors and stuff from coral bell leaves. Like they just are super interesting. But they're really popular. A lot of people, if they know two shade plants, they know hostas and coral bells. So I would really recommend these. I think they're so cool. I think they're just like that lime green color is just super impressive. Like you're not gonna hardly find that on any other plant. So here we go. Bleeding hearts actually do awesome in full shade. They're kind of an old-fashioned plant that you don't see quite as much as you used to, but they do really well in the shade, and they are a really prolific bloomer. One thing about the bleeding hearts, though, is they will die back to the ground as it gets hot. So a lot of people are like, oh, my bleeding hearts are just not doing very well. And we're like, well, it's July, and it's just what they do. So as soon as it gets too hot, they die back all the way to the ground. Really pretty plants, though. You can see the reason why they're called bleeding heart is because those really interesting flowers look like hearts that are bleeding. This is a very common plant in English style gardens, but they do great in the shade. Columbines. So columbines are a full sun plant in some parts of the country, but in Utah, where we are really, really hot and really, really dry in the summer, they do like to have some shade. They don't love a lot of dense shade, but if you can give them some dapple shade, like a little bit of light is filtering through the tree, or some morning sun, but then afternoon shade, that's their sweet spot. That's when you're going to get a lot of really amazing blooms that are going to last quite a while. But they also kind of die back when it gets hot, so don't stress about that if that happens. And they are typically a short-lived perennial, but just like the foxgloves, they do reseed themselves quite well. So if you are worried about them, don't worry, they'll probably reseed themselves. And another really interesting fact is this is the state flower of Minnesota. So fun things to think about. Sweet woodruff. I think this is one of the cutest little ground covers ever. It does have the ability to take over an area, so just be aware that it's not going to stay super small. It's over time, and it doesn't just take over an area like field bindweed or anything like that does, but it will take over an area over time. And it gets these white, really sweet smelling flowers in the spring that are just so cute. And then it has those like mini palmate leaves, which when we're talking from like a botanical standpoint, a palmate leaf is just a multi-leafed or a leaf that has multi-leaflets that all meet at one point. So you remember that because it's like the palm of your hand, all your fingers meet at one point. So they have these palmate leaves that are just kind of an interesting texture that we don't see in a lot of plants. And it is really good for pollinators, does well in the shade, but you can put it in areas with a little more sun, but it will need more water if you put it in sunny areas. And then this one also is consistently my top 5 favorite plants of all time. So this plant is called hellebore, also known as Lenten rose, because they bloom around Lent, which is in February. So in our area, this plant is blooming as soon as it's
able to poke through the snow, which is pretty incredible. And these blooms last forever. Like this was and it still is pretty popular, but this was like the plant for a few years, maybe like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. People would take the blooms and put them face side up and float them in water. And that was you put it in the middle of your table, and they would just last forever, for over a week sometimes. But like one plant on the flower will last for a month and a half even. And it's really cool because it has evergreen leaves. And so another way to kind of have more winter interest, which I'm just always talking about, is to plant stuff with evergreen leaves like this particular plant does. Comes in many different colors, mostly within the range of white to red, and some purples as well. So you get a lot of magentas, lots of pinks. There's even some really cool green varieties that they've bred. There are double flowers, and they've even started breeding some where the plant, most hellebore flowers kind of hang to the side or down, but they've started breeding them so some are facing up, so they're just a little bit more showy. But these ones are really cool because they not only do they like the shade, but they like the dry shade. Like they're like, yes, I can handle very little water and zero light. So a really nice hardy little plant. This Brunera is got such an interesting foliage that I just had to put it in here. It's also, another name is called bug gloss, and that name comes from the Roman word for cat tongue, because these leaves are kind of rough, and just the shape that reminded somebody of a cat tongue, I guess. So that's why I got that name. The flowers are really interesting because they look like forget-me-not flowers, but most forget-me-nots die back to the ground every year, and these ones don't. So these you put in the shade, you get this little flush of really cute flowers in the springtime, and they die back, but then you have a really cute little light green foliage the rest of the year. So hopefully that gave you guys some ideas about some shade plants. We get asked about shade plants all the time. And then think about like the astilbe plant. We talked about the tag. I didn't put a slide in there, but astilbes do really well in our area in the shade. So we're going to talk about Utah natives and pollinators in the same few slides. And the reason why I've lumped the Utah natives and the pollinator plants together is because Utah has more native bees than any other state in the union. So we have more native bees that we really need to be thinking about. And as you know, our communities are expanding, we're taking over natural habitat. It's a really nice thing to do for the bees to add some plants that are good for them. And there are a lot of our native bees that are very specific to what types of plants they're even able to pollinate. So adding a few of these to your yard is a really nice thing for you to do for the bees. So this sulfur buckwheat so all of these are Utah natives is what I'm saying over the next few slides. But this sulfur buckwheat is kind of an interesting little plant. It stays really low to the ground. It's a matted ground cover, but it stays just in a nice little round form. But in the summertime, you're gonna get like a flush of these yellow cute flowers. I don't really think they're that spectacular, but they look really nice. They're, kind of adorable. And the bees just love it though. But when the flowers are done blooming, they do have a really interesting seed head that'll keep looking interesting the rest of the year. These desert 4 o'clocks are highly recommended by the staff at Weber Basin Water Conservancy District, as you can see by my note, because this is just like such a hardy, very, very interesting plant. It is a Utah native. Mostly we see it in the southern half of the state, but it doesn't need any water once it's established. Neither does that buckwheat from the previous slide. But this one's kind of cool because it has one big long taproot, which is why it's so drought tolerant. That root just goes down forever. But you can get a relatively large plant. Like this thing will reach, maybe a foot, 2 feet tall max, but it can grow up to 8 feet wide. And it all is growing from one central point at that taproot. But when this plant is done in the fall, it's just like, I am done blooming. I am done trying to be a green plant. It'll just break itself off at that taproot. And you just pick the whole plant up like a tumbleweed and put it in your garbage. So kind of cool. And then this also has that tubular shaped flower that really will attract our native hummingbirds. Bee balm is a Utah native. The native variety is this purple variety, but bee balm comes in so many different colors: reds, orange, yellows. This pink color, or this purplish color, is by far the most common, but it does come in other colors. But so many pollinators love this plant. And just, you know, as the name denotes, it's really like a good one for the bees. It does like a little bit more water than some of the other Utah natives. That being said, though, this is another one that we have in an area, and it doesn't take over an area to the point that a weed does, but it does kind of fill in its space. And it's moved away from some of the emitters. And once again, you know, you can tell which areas are receiving water from our drip emitters, because those bee balm plants will be bigger than the ones that aren't getting any water, but they all bloom and they all look really good. So kind of a good low water, but bigger if you do give them more water plant. So here's another penstemon. We have a lot of penstemons, like I was saying. So, you know, lots to pick from. But this firecracker penstemon is really popular. This is the one that you see when you're driving around in the spring and you see spiky red plants on road berms or in the mountains. It's probably this guy. And it really likes poor nutrient soils. A lot of these plants that are, you know, they don't want any excess water. They're Utah natives. They don't, you know, they can handle our really bad soils. They really prefer to have poor nutrient soils as well. So you don't even need to amend your sandbox that you're trying to grow your garden in some parts of our service area. So it likes to have poor nutrient soils, and it doesn't want you to add a lot of organic matter, or it has the tendency to rot. And this is another one that once it's established, you don't need any irrigation to it. You know, I say that, but if we're having like an exceptionally hot, dry year, a lot of these plants do benefit from being squirted with some water once or twice a month. But this one also, when the blooms die back, it doesn't really look that great. So it's a good idea to just go in and deadhead it to keep it looking nice and compact and well. And this is another one. Bees do like these penstemons. This particular penstemon, the tube-shaped flower is really long and narrow, and so it's kind of more difficult for the bees to get in, but the hummingbirds love it. But most of the penstemons are a wider tube, and so the bees can get up there and they'll pollinate as well. This is kind of a fun one, evening primrose. The reason it's called evening primrose is because it's from the primrose family, but these blossoms, they'll close in the evening. Nope, I said that wrong. They close in the morning and they'll stay closed all day, and then they'll open up as soon as it kind of starts to get cool in the evening. So this one's kind of interesting because while it doesn't attract a lot of the pollinators that we, you know, just kind of automatically assume as beneficial pollinators, because those ones are active during the day, it does attract a lot of our native moth varieties that are active during the night. This is another one that doesn't need any water once it's established, and it blooms early summer, but it does bloom for a while. Like this is one that'll bloom for a month maybe. So, but it's just kind of interesting how it opens and closes with the weather. So there are a handful of plants that do this, and a lot of them, if you like take time and pay attention, will notice that the blooms are typically white or light pink, and that's just so that the pollinators will be able to see them in the moonlight. And so people will sometimes create areas of a garden that are called moonlight gardens, and it's because, you know, and then they fill it up with these white plants that open during the nighttime. So kind of an interesting thing. So we only have a couple more slides, and I ran out of time when I was making this presentation, so I didn't include a lot of information about these deer-resistant plants. But you will notice how a lot of these plants are the same plants that we've literally just talked about. One thing to notice with deer-resistant plants is that they are typically plants that have a strong smell or a strong flavor. Deer typically don't appreciate a lot of flavor in their stuff, I guess. So the component of the plant that gives it a strong smell or a strong flavor are things called tannins or oils. And they can be quite bitter. And, you know, it's so funny because as humans, we love that. We're like, yeah, lavender, you know, I'm going to take it and bake that oil into a biscuit, you know, or we take oregano or basil, and that flavor is a defense mechanism that the plant has created that most, you know, pests don't like, but we as humans are like, woohoo, can't get enough of it. So, and on the next couple slides, I did put zones because a lot of the people that we talk to that are having issues with deer live at higher elevations. So once again, if you're having a hard time getting stuff to survive through the winter, then I have added on some zones. So like the bee balm, zone 3. So it's good to know if you live high altitudes and you're worried, it's a good hardy cold tolerant one. But so we have the bee balm, which we've already talked about, lavender, which we've already talked about, hyssop, which we've already talked about, which you're all going to go and buy because it's my favorite. Sweet woodruff, which we've already talked about, and peonies typically do okay with the deer. And I know that sometimes, you know, we're like, oh, deer don't eat that. And you're like, well, sometimes deer, they will, you know, if we're having a particularly bad winter, sometimes just for the sake of survival, deer will eat a lot of things that they don't typically like. So like peonies are probably one of those. Foxgloves, we already talked about, it's probably not the wisest thing for the deer to eat the plant because they're full of toxic chemicals that will just stop their heart. You know, it's a little bit of revenge, I guess, if they get desperate, but they typically just leave the foxglove alone. Yarrow, we've already talked about. Russian sage, we've already talked about. A lot of these plants, like I said, with those strong smells, typically aren't tempting to them. And I did put in some of the herbs that are common in our gardens that are perennials. Sage is such a good little perennial herb. I just think it's so pretty, and it does put on a really interesting purple flower. Some varieties do, but I think that it's just such a delicious herb. It's a good idea to just put one in your yard. The thyme that I have pictured is called woolly thyme. You can see how there's some little pubescence or like some fuzz on all of the leaves. The deer don't like, not only do they not like the taste of thyme, but they don't like that like feeling of that fuzz against their leaves or against the fuzz on the leaves against their tongue. They don't like that feeling. So if you guys are familiar with the lamb's ear plant, that's also another one that the deer are not particularly fond of simply because they don't like that fuzzy texture. That the bottom left hand corner, that ornamental oregano. So oregano in general is not really desirable for deer or other foraging animals. And the Greek oregano that is the most common culinary oregano that we use in cooking does really well in our area, but it will become a weed. So that and mint, I never ever recommend that people put those into the ground in their gardens. I always recommend that you use them or you put them in a pot and either put the pot directly in the ground if you like that look, or just keep it on the patio. And both mint and oregano will do fine surviving through the winter in a pot. But the type of oregano that I have shown is an ornamental oregano. And I think that the ornamental oregano has one of the most unique looking flowers of any plant. You can see how interesting those pink petals are against the light green, against the dark green of the foliage. I just think it's a really attractive looking little plant. This one would do awesome in an English style garden. It does need more moderate water, but it looks so cool and it smells so good. But then we have the mint family. Really anything in the mint family is a good option. Once again, though, it will absolutely take over your yard. So it's a good idea to put those in a pot. So I think that might be all the slides that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and answer some of these questions that we have now. So one question asks, and this is just a reminder for those that might have joined us late. We don't really have a good way to facilitate the, raising of the hand feature on Zoom. So if you have a question, just type it straight into the question and answer box, and I'll try and get to some of these. So let's see, does it cause more mold when you water at night versus in the morning? For the most part, not really in our area. In other parts of the country that have more humidity than we do, it can become an issue. And, even snow mold or just different types of mold on perennials and lawn particularly become more prevalent when you water in the morning or in the evening versus in the morning. And that's just because when you water in the evening, it's, you don't have the warm weather to quickly evaporate the excess moisture off of the leaves and off of the stems of the plants. And so they sit wet all night and into the morning when it finally gets warm enough to dry the plants off. So where we are though, it's a humid day if we reach double digits in our humidity. So we typically don't have to worry about it. So I would say no. That being said though, I just barely talked about how it's better for the slug populations or keeping slug populations down if you water your hostas in the morning versus at night. That can be kind of a help. So I hope that answered that question. When it comes to irrigating though, I would focus more on when do I have better pressure. So if all of your neighbors are watering in the evening and at night, and so you're not getting very good pressure and you're having a hard time running your system, watering or if they're doing everything in the morning, like you having to water in the evening to get the proper amount of pressure isn't gonna, you're not gonna see a crazy explosion of mold or pests from doing that. So I hope that answered that question. Let's see, the next one, which varieties bloom more upward? I have these, but you can really never see the blooms. I'm assuming you typed this while I was talking, so I'm not sure which plant you're specifically talking about. So maybe put a follow-up question. Which varieties bloom more upwards? I have these, but you can. Oh, the hellebores. Oh yeah. So I don't know specifics. I couldn't just rattle off some varieties of specific ones that do bloom with their faces pointing up instead of down. But I was at Willard Bay Gardens, which is, a local nursery in northern Utah. It was early spring, because I was there buying pansies, and they had a ton of different hellebores, and I would say probably a third of them had nice blooms pointing upwards. So in my mind, I don't think that that it would be too difficult to find those if you just went to a nursery that specializes in perennials and has a good selection. Also, should I cut the foliage back more? You really don't have to with the hellebores. What we do with ours, and we have some in our own learning garden, I go through every once in a while and just cut off whatever looks dead. And it's a pretty hardy plant. It doesn't do much or doesn't need much maintenance. So once in a while, if someone runs over it with the car or someone steps on it and breaks some little branches off, those will die back, and I go through and clean that up. But I typically don't do anything else with ours. It might work okay to cut the foliage back a little bit in order to expose some of the blooms, but that's kind of trying to alter the natural growing pattern of the plant, which I maybe wouldn't recommend, and probably won't hurt it, so you could try it. But it sounds like you have a good excuse to go buy more plants to me, which is never a bad thing. So I hope that answered that as well. And then the last question, Is there a good website that lists information for perennials like the tree browser website? So there are some really good databases out there. We're working on a database right now, but Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District has a really good one. So if you go to conservationgardenpark.org, which I know that's like a huge mouthful, so I'll just say it again, conservationgardenpark.org, they have a plant finder that's very similar to Utah State University's tree browser website. So for those of you who don't know, Utah State University has come up with a really cool tree browser website, and they're continually adding more trees to it. But you can get in there, and it has a list of a ton of trees that do great in Utah. And you can start eliminating trees based off of a search criteria. So if you're like, I want a large tree and I want it to have, you know, these features and not have any fruit, and you can kind of start to narrow it down until you get just a couple options. You can go into the nursery and say, I want one of these 3 trees. So Jordan Valley does have that really good database for perennials, trees, shrubs, and you can go in and say, like, I want a pink blooming flower that's going to bloom in the spring that's pollinator friendly, and you hit find and it'll come up with some options. You do have to be careful about getting so narrow in your search. You know, if you say I want a purple flower that blooms in the fall and gets this tall and pollinator and Utah native, like there just might not be a plant out there that matches, but it's a good little resource. So hopefully that answered that as well. Let's see. Which of these perennials would work especially well, in your opinion, in a full sun border retaining wall where there isn't irrigation, trying to control weeds and beautify? So if you're trying to control weeds, I would maybe focus on plants that are good, thick ground covers that will outcompete the weeds. And let's see, a full sun border retaining wall. So a lot of succulents do really well in retaining walls, especially if there's not an irrigation. One thing about full sun retaining walls, the rocks are going to absorb a lot of heat, and they're gonna stay really warm. And even as, you know, night comes, those rocks stay warm and they dry out the soil so fast. So I'm trying to think of plants that would do well in a retaining wall that wouldn't need any irrigation. Some of the succulents wouldn't need a lot of water, but you would probably still want to go out there once in a while, either once a week to once every other week, depending on what the weather's doing, and at least spray it down. Even if it's just a little, you know, or a good spray with a hose, that could go a long way. But so we talked about the sedums. Those typically do really well with very little to hardly any irrigation. Some of like and it's going to outcompete the weeds, and so will that ice plant that we talked about as well with the yellow flower. And then the mints will do it, but you probably don't want to plant those because it's going to take over the world. Those evening primrose will do really well, but they're not so thick and hardy that they're going to outcompete any weeds, but they'll do okay in that situation without a lot of extra water. If you're familiar with the plant hen and chicks, they're going to do okay without a lot of water. And I'm going to leave it at that. But if you need more suggestions, go ahead and email me. So my email is Terry, which Terry @weberbasin.com. And you're more than welcome to email either Dave or I, and we're happy to help you find the right plant for your yard. So if you need more suggestions, let us know, and we'll try and get those answered, or try and get more suggestions to you. So if you guys have any other questions, type them right now. Otherwise, I just want to say thanks for joining us for this class. I hope you guys learned something. We typically try to post all of our videos on our website the next day if we can. But if it's not up by Monday, maybe contact us. And otherwise, we will assume that you guys are good because I don't see any other questions. So once again, thanks for joining us. Oh, something I guess I should say. So we have been doing these webinars every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, but we typically take the month of July off simply because people are so busy in July, and maybe with the coronavirus, it's going to be a little bit different, but our class attendance usually goes down. And so, we like taking a break. We assume you guys like to have a break. And so we won't be teaching any classes through July. We might do one the very last week of July. We had one, a live class planned, but we'll see how that comes about. But we will try to email everybody if you're on our emailing list to let you know what's coming up. We'll put it in our regular ads and on our social media platforms as well. So sounds good. Thanks guys for joining.